Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Tina McAndrew, the director of the Randall Library, and I'm really excited to be here tonight since I had to miss last month. I'm grateful to Sally for always including me in these programs that she is so great at organizing, and I'm really anxious to hear Jane's talk tonight. I wanted to thank the Randall Library Friends for sponsoring this program tonight. And just as an FYI, Randa will be hosting an author visit via Zoom with Emma Bamford. She is living in England and she wrote a book called Deep Water. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out and we can give you all of the login information. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sally.
Okay, thanks, Tina. My name is Sally Thurston. I do adult programming at the Maynard Library, and we are so happy to have Jane back with us tonight. I believe this is her 10th appearance at the Maynard Library, and I believe third at Stowe. Is that right, Tina?
Yes. Yes.
Sorry to do that right before you go.
Yeah, no, a drink always, right?
So I would also like to thank the Friends of the Maynard Library for their support of this program. And I have two program notes. We're co-sponsoring a program tomorrow night called The Other Madisons in Search of Mandy. That is a woman's story about tracing her relatives back to James Madison and his enslaved cook. That presentation's at 1 o'clock, so a special time for us. I'll put the registration in the chat in case you're interested in attending that. And the Maynard Library is hosting its very first tiny art show. So you can come and get a kit that has a 3x3 canvas and create whatever you'd like, and then we'll have a gallery show. I think we can move right along. In terms of some Zoom technology, feel free to type your questions for Jane into the chat. She'll answer them during the Q&A session at the end. And we have enabled transcription for tonight. So that's in your Zoom controls at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to see a transcript. All right, so we are delighted to have Jane Oneail back with us again tonight. She holds a master's in art history from Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She's worked at some of New Hampshire's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. She's also taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at Southern New Hampshire University. Jane will be speaking tonight about the landscape as canvas, earth arts. Take it away, Jane.
All right, thank you, Sally and Tina. Thank you so much for organizing this. And thank you everybody for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about the subject. I promise you, you're in for a good time over the course of the next hour. This is got to be one of my favorite of all of my programs. And I'm just delighted that I get the chance to share it again. So tonight, what we're going to be doing is diving into the wider conceptual art movement of earth art that was generally rooted around the 1960s and the 1970s. It was established by a group of mostly American and British artists who were investigating natural sites, novel materials, novel modes of production, really. And they were working largely outside of the commercial gallery system, outside of the museum system too. So they're doing really innovative things. There is, of course, much more to it than that. We'll be digging into it, and I might be leaning into all of these earth puns and digging and that sort of thing. Let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll move through the material tonight. The image on the screen here is an Andy Goldsworthy installation, and it's just called Wood Line. And so we can see that he's used these tree trunks to form this kind of meander through the path of this eucalyptus grove in San Francisco. And this is how we're going to sort of meander through the material tonight. So we're going to start off with the sort of prehistory to earth art. There's all these incredible monuments that really have existed for thousands of years. that were in so many ways the earliest version of earth art. So we'll take a look at that, and then we'll take a look at what was happening in the 1960s and the 1970s that really set the stage for this artistic movement. We're not going to do a comprehensive overview of earth art because that would take us hours, weeks, years. So tonight, what we're going to do is look at 4 different artists, and they are all fantastic in their own right. And there's enough variety here that I think it's a really satisfying overview, and just really fun to see how these 4 different artists approach this topic, this medium at this time. And then we'll wrap up very quickly because I'm sure we'll go a little bit long, but let's get started with the seeds and the roots, our comprehensive, our look at the earliest versions of earth art that existed. So if you were already thinking about this installation here, one that is so familiar to so many people, you are on the right track. This is, of course, Stonehenge in Wiltshire, England. It dates to about 3000 BC. Most of us know it as this monument that probably served as like an early calendar to early agrarian societies. And if you've never been there, it's hard to imagine and appreciate the scale of this installation. These standing stones are about 18 feet high, so about 3 times the size of a person. You can get a sense of human scale just over here. And of course, this outer ring would have had horizontal lintel stones carried across them as well. All of this was constructed with stones that were excavated tens of miles away and then put into place, of course, by human hands. And this was without the aid of the wheel. The wheel had not been invented yet. So how this incredible earthwork was created is still very mysterious to us today. There's all these different ideas, different theories in terms of how it was put into place. So the purpose beyond maybe serving as a calendar, we know that certain stones line up with the sun on the solstice, but it seems to have a greater sort of metaphysical purpose that we've never completely pinned down, and perhaps we'll never fully understand. There's always different theories emerging about what Stonehenge was really about, but in the end, this was a human undertaking using natural materials, and it created this structure, this site that is still admired and really, to a certain degree, sort of worshipped today. Now, our next site is also familiar to most. Oftentimes, architectural historians lump the Great Pyramids of Giza under the umbrella of architecture. But for our purposes tonight, we're going to think of them as another example of an earthwork. And oftentimes this arrangement of these major pyramids here, these 3 major pyramids, has been ascribed to having some sort of relationship with the stars in the sky, their placement in particular. I think over the years that's probably been mostly debunked, but it's something that you hear quite a bit about still. And I think that's another important idea that we're going to be touching on with tonight's program. So many of these major earthwork undertakings do have a relationship with the heavens. And I think we like to imagine that and maybe project that onto the building of the pyramids too. Of course, if you're familiar with the pyramids, you know that they are mostly solid stone structures that were used to house the bodies, the tombs of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. Now, if you've never been to Egypt, I think seeing these stones up close and in person is absolutely mesmerizing. You can see the figure down here at the bottom, and we're looking up the side of the Great Pyramid of Giza. You can see just how large these stones are, how precisely they're cut and placed into this setting. And now this was, roughly 5,000 years ago, 2,500 BC. So once again, this was all done without the aid of the modern wheel. So this larger kind of mysterious metaphysical purpose that aligned so many people in terms of constructing something like this, excavating the stone, moving the stone, putting it into place, is something that is clearly still fascinates people to this day. The next early site that I wanted to share with you is in South America, the Nazca lines in Peru. Now, these were created by many generations of people, basically between 500 BC and 500 AD. And these lines that some of them are just straight lines that go on for extensive expanses, but some of them are effigies, like this monkey that we see here with this kind of delightful spiral tail and these big fingers here. These lines were created basically by just shifting some pebbles and soil aside. It's like a little 6-inch trench that created these lines. And because this desert is so remote, and because the weather here is so stable, the lines have stayed in place for quite some time. So I just wanted to take you through and get an appreciation of the incredible drawings that were done, seemingly, again, another celestial connection here, for observers in the sky. These are such large drawings, they cannot be appreciated from the ground. Some of them are 400 feet long, some of them are 1,000 feet long. This is a spider, of course. Now we've got a flower over here with a hummingbird with these fantastic wings and feathers. And then, of course, the most mysterious probably out of all of these Nazca lines, what looks to be like a human figure that seems to be waving, recognizing a presence and greeting someone. So, of course, people love to speculate in terms of the reason why these lines were created and where they would have been viewed from. So just a few last sites that I wanted to share with you, and these are from North America. What we're looking at over here on the left is, I believe, the largest man-made mound in North America. This is in Illinois. And so for a moment, just imagine moving all of this earth. It's about 100 feet high. You can see figures at the top here and a figure down below. Doing all of this without the aid of heavy equipment, this is a massive undertaking. It's a man-made mountain, essentially. And it would have been created about around 1000 AD. And it would have been created because society at that time had been stratified, that there were rulers, that there were religious leaders that could have summoned the efforts of the people of the community to create something like this that was either kind of a site for power or something related to burial or religious services. The other major site here in North America that I wanted to share with you is in, I believe, Southern Ohio. We're looking at an aerial view here of a large serpent. You can see this snake-like form, that stretches on for about 1,300 feet. And this is more than 2,000 years old. It's the largest serpentine effigy in the world. We don't know why it was created. Once again, it's all about moving earth in order to create this raised form. And once again, we have this wonderful spiral, just sort of like that monkey's tail that we saw before. So we'll just circle back to Stonehenge that we see up here at the top of the screen, and then down below to a crop circle. I never thought I'd show a crop circle in one of my programs, but here we are. The debunked idea of mysterious visitors creating these geometric patterns in crops around the world. These are, in fact, another great example of earthworks. It's using natural materials in order to create works of art. And once again, it's in a spiral form. We'll be certainly circling back to that idea over the course of the evening. But I also wanted to share with you just a couple of things that were happening in the art world and beyond in the 1960s and 70s that really set the stage for this artistic movement. The first thing that was happening in the 1960s, and this was really something that earth artists and conceptual artists were revolting against, is pop art. We've, of course, got Andy Warhol Coke bottles over here, screen printed Coke bottles that could easily pass as just a simple Coca-Cola advertisement in their own right. And then a soft sculpture over here on the right by Klaus Oldenburg. This is called French Fries and Ketchup from 1963. Sort of a nod to fast food culture. Both of these works are about consumerism and waste to a certain extent as well. So this type of full embrace of capitalist consumerist society was something that earth artists were not at all interested in, and really in many ways fully rejected. Now, the other thing that was happening in the art world was minimalism. And this was something that was really influential to a lot of these earth artists. We're looking at a work by the artist Carl Andre called Equivalent 8. This dates to 1966. And he did a whole series of these equivalent installations just out of bricks. And he would stack the bricks in different formations. So I believe it was a total number of 120 bricks. So you could stack them, higher or longer and flatter. But this was the particular configuration for, the 8th in the series. Now, this was called the most boring controversy in the history of art because the Tate Museum in London paid about $6,000 for this particular minimalist installation. And people were kind of up in arms that anybody would spend that much money on literally just a pile of bricks. But with minimalist art, what these artists are really doing is prompting us to think about the materials themselves and how they change the space that we're in, how they make us think about the space that we occupy, and think about sort of these pure formal aspects of our relationship with sculpture in a way that really works of art hadn't done before. So hold on to that thought and we'll see it kind of resurface again. Other things that were happening in the world at large was a sort of a growing awareness of human impact on the environment. So we have Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring from 1962, which was, sounding the alarm bells essentially in terms of what was happening to the environment, particularly in terms of synthetic pesticides. And because of this book, really throughout the 1960s, there was this kind of growing awareness and growing alarm about the way we treat the planet. Couple that with this remarkable photo. This is from Apollo 8. It was taken in 1968 by the astronaut Bill Anders. And this one image had such an impact on the way people thought about how we utilize the resources on this planet. It's called Earthrise. And of course, we're seeing the Earth from the surface of the moon, or at least the moon is in our foreground here. And we can just see the Earth as this tiny blue ball floating in space, completely isolated and looking so small relative to everything else. And it helped to sort of push along this growing understanding that that we have just this one planet and we have to treat it accordingly. So that kind of ushers in the early 1970s and this renewed sort of interest in the environment and some real changes to help mark that. The first of them being the founding of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the establishment of Earth Day. That both of those things happened in 1970. We can see Pat and Richard Nixon planting a tree on the lawn of the White House for the very first Earth Day. But we also see, people gathering. This is Union Square in New York City, and they're protesting. They are alarmed by what's happening to the planet. They're concerned about pollution, air pollution, water pollution, solid waste disposal. All of these things were being brought to the fore, and people were they had this new consciousness around these issues. And so we'll kind of top this all off with the very famous ad from Keep America Beautiful that involved the man playing a figure of a Native American, where he's kind of walking through the landscape and he sees all of the litter, and then he turns to the camera with that consequential single tear that goes down his cheek. Reminding everybody with the TV at the time just how important it was to keep America clean and beautiful and litter free. So all of this is sort of out there in the ether as artists begin to think about using literally the earth as their canvas, and sometimes as their paintbrush. So that brings us to moments like this, where we can see from this art installation that an artist has literally just poured soil on the floor here, in between these these mirrors. Some of them are on the floor and some of them are perpendicular to it, up against the wall, sort of expanding our sense of what that soil is. And so you might be looking at this and thinking, oh my God, don't give me another hour of just piles of dirt. But let's think about this for a moment. Give him the benefit of the doubt, because of course, dirt, soil is what we, kick off our shoes when we come home at night, but it's also what we grow our food in. It's absolutely essential to our existence here on Earth. And we so often think of it as an annoyance. So these artists are asking us to think of it in new ways. Now, the artist in this case is Robert Smithson, and he is going to kick things off for us because he is generally considered, well, he is known to be really the founder of this movement. So here are a couple of photos of Robert Smithson, probably in his early to mid 30s here. He really coined the term land art. Land art and earth art are pretty much interchangeable. He grew up in New Jersey. He went to New York City and got really an education as an art student. I mean, he was initially really interested in artists like Jackson Pollock, but he shifted to sculpture after a little while. He shifted from painting to sculpture and then to conceptual art. So he's thinking about works like Carl Andre's Pile of Bricks, and he finds representation in a gallery in New York City, and that gallery owner connects him with all of the leading conceptual artists of the day. So Carl Andre, Donald Judd, Robert Morris, and actually even a woman named Nancy Holt, who ends up marrying Robert Smithson. And we'll be learning a little bit more about Nancy Holt this evening. So those relationships really sort of propelled Robert Smithson in this work. So we can see two more photographs of Robert Smithson here, one with an installation where he's literally just brought rocks into a gallery and he's looking at us and at the camera here very seriously. And here's a photograph of him loading probably those very same rocks into the back of a station wagon. And every time I look at this picture, I kind of laugh a little bit because I can imagine whoever's taking this photograph, working with this man who thinks, I got to bring these rocks to this gallery, is probably either thinking this man is a genius or he's totally crazy. But Robert Smithson got really interested in the landscape as an art medium when he was visiting New Jersey, going home for a little while, and he saw this excavator kind of digging through the earth and bringing up these huge stones. And it sort of reminded him of like these ancient ruins. And so rocks became particularly interesting to him. So he would bring these installations into galleries and then put on the walls the maps and the aerial views of where these rocks were from. Just a few years later, he's bringing things like giant dead trees into galleries. This is literally a restaging of his original dead tree from 1969, which you can see he also strategically places some mirrors in here too. So I think there's supposed to be a little bit of actual reflection between the viewer and the dead tree here. But the dead tree brings up this bigger idea that Robert Smithson was really interested in, and that was his fascination with entropy, the second law of thermodynamics that predicts the inevitable depletion and collapse of any and every system. Couple that with this notion that he saw that most of America, most of the world, thought that we were on the steady march of progress, particularly after World War II. Life is just getting better and better and better. And with his really profound connection with this idea of entropy, he saw us in the middle of sort of coming apart, and that the world was going, well, sort of bad things were in store. And so his artwork and these selections that he was making for gallery viewing really spoke to that. So you were supposed to go in and appreciate, the ancient roots and the desiccated leaves and this dying tree right in front of you. Now, to his benefit, Robert Smithson sort of got outside and traveled a little bit at the end of the 1960s. And he was going to places like this Neolithic tomb that we see over here from the UK. And he visited Balance Rock in, I believe this is Utah, in national park, I believe, in Utah there. Oh yeah, Arches National Park. And so when he's out and he's seeing these man-made and natural formations, he's thinking about earth art on a grander scale, not just bringing rocks and dirt into galleries, but what more can he do? And that leads us to his greatest and best known work, and probably the best known work of earth art that exists today. This is Spiral Jetty from 1970. This is a work that Robert Smithson called an earthwork, and he coined that term earthwork as well. The name comes actually from, surprisingly, a dystopian novel. So what we're looking at is a counterclockwise coil, this spiral of a jetty that extends out into the Great Salt Lake. And of course, the spiral form is one that exists in nature, but this is a completely man-made form. Unlike those prehistoric models that we saw before, he engaged heavy equipment in order to make this spiral jetty. And I should mention too that he received funding from that gallerist, the woman who was representing him in New York City, in order to do this. So there was also a film made of him overseeing the construction of the spiral jetty. I believe these are just a few of the outtakes. So in the end, they moved about 6,000 tons of earth to create this jetty that's about 1,600 feet long and about 15 feet wide. Here it is. One of the really interesting things to me, when you see photos of the spiral jetty, oftentimes the water of the Great Salt Lake looks, well, it looks strange, like strange colors. And it's a good reminder that it's the Salt Lake. It's a terminal basin, which means water flows in, but there's no way for it to leave. So it's just this constant process of evaporation. And so it's very dense with salt and other minerals. Really nothing can live in it except for like these microorganisms that sometimes turn the water pink. So you can see some great effects in pictures like this. And Robert Smithson just loved this idea of like the Great Salt Lake sort of looking like the primordial seas. So the location here was just perfect for him. So indulge me for a moment in just thinking about for a moment why he might have chosen this spiral form. We saw plenty of precursors to this spiral in earlier examples of earthworks, going all the way back to maybe 500 BC with the Nazca lines. And of course, as I mentioned, spirals exist in nature. They exist throughout nature. They exist in our bodies with our fingerprints all the way up to the very shape of our galaxies. Spirals also have this wonderful connection to math itself. So if you were to just add 1 + 1, you get 3, or sorry, 2, and then 1 + 2, you get 3, 2 + 3, you get 5. And the ever increasing numbers, if you were to map them out on a grid, create this very nice spiral shape. You also get this wonderful connection to the history of art and this interest in math with the Fibonacci numbers and the golden ratio. So it's not exactly the same thing as a spiral, but it's very closely related. And it's probably best understood when we look at a picture like Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa from 1503. So this is grounded in a mathematical principle in terms of sort of what makes something beautiful. This is why the Renaissance artists called it the divine ratio. But it's this basic thinking that if you take a rectangle and then divide it into a square and then a subsequent smaller rectangle, that if the proportions are correct, that smaller rectangle has the same aspect ratio of the larger rectangle, you have accomplished the golden ratio. And so something like the Mona Lisa is nothing but the golden ratio. You can sort of carve out that perfect square with the subsequent perfect rectangle adjacent to it throughout this picture. And incidentally, you can do that on her face and it creates that spiral form right there on the face of the Mona Lisa. So there's all these fascinating connections back to spirals and our very selves and our universe that maybe Robert Smithson is trying to kind of tap into. But as I was thinking and looking at the spiral jetty, I was really thinking about, well, what's the point? Are we supposed to go there? Are we supposed to walk down this jetty and around the spiral and sort of take in the landscape and then just turn around and walk home? What's really the point of this? Are we supposed to travel there like it is a destination? And what is our experience of it supposed to be? And as I'm thinking about, and I should mention too, that it's about 2 hours away from the closest airport. So it would really be a pilgrimage to go to something like this. And as I was thinking about pilgrimages, I was reminded that this spiral jetty really reminds me of Gothic labyrinths, the kind of mazes, the patterns that you would see in the stonework of a Gothic cathedral. So pilgrims would be walking this meander like this, and it was supposed to be something that that is transformative to their bodies and their souls. And perhaps Robert Smithson was thinking the same thing for us. And in fact, Harvard researchers have determined that when you walk these Gothic labyrinths, like you see over here on the right, it does have this tremendous impact on your body. It lowers your blood pressure, your heart rate. It actually eases chronic pain to walk something like this. So perhaps Robert Smithson was even tapping into that larger notion. Now, the most important idea that Robert Smithson was thinking of when he created the spiral jetty was that this was something sort of related to natural forms, but completely man-made, and it was going to be left there forever. And eventually, according to the laws of thermodynamics and entropy, eventually nature would take it over. Now, people sort of forgot about the spiral jetty almost immediately after he created it because the waters of the Great Salt Lake completely covered it. But in recent years, the waters have receded so dramatically that the spiral is no longer in the water. So we have this whole new perspective on it. And that's not to say that eventually nature won't just take over the spiral jetty, but it's interesting to think that that's happening in a way that Robert Smithson never imagined. Now, Robert Smithson, I just wanted to share very quickly one last work from the artist. This is called the Amarillo Ramp. And it's essentially it was an unfinished work that was finished by other artists because what he had planned here was a ramp that was going to start in another basin of water and eventually sort of circle up to the surface of the water. But as he was surveying this land from an airplane, the plane crashed and Robert Smithson died at the age of 35. So it was a few other earth artists, including Nancy Holt, who was his wife, who ensured that the Amarillo ramp was finished. But Smithson himself said that nature is never finished. So for him, it was really about creating this thing that nature would eventually take apart. So let's turn our attention now to Nancy Holt, the woman that married Robert Smithson, the woman who was creating earthworks in her own right. I like to think of her as a local girl because she grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts. She ended up attending high school in New Jersey, which is actually where she met Robert Smithson in high school. And then she went to Tufts and I believe graduated with a degree in biology in 1960. From there, she moved to New York City. She reconnects with Robert Smithson. She's running in these very high-minded artistic circles and meeting all of these conceptual artists. And within a few years, she and Robert Smithson are married and living together in the West Village. And she takes on the role really of documentarian. She feels most comfortable behind the camera. She's the person who actually filmed the 30-minute documentary of Robert Smithson creating the spiral jetty. But shortly after that, she shifts gears and she begins to feel more comfortable or just as comfortable creating earthworks herself. So I want to introduce you to one of her early earthworks created just a few years after Robert Smithson's spiral jetty. This is called the Sun Tunnels, and this is in the Great Basin Desert in Utah. So this is it's simply what you see. It is these large concrete tunnels that are arranged very specifically that also have these holes punched in them very specifically. And you can see how large they are in terms of human scale here. Now, what she is doing here is using this ability to frame an image or frame a view, not like a picture frame, but with a lens, a camera lens here. And she is framing specific vistas for us with the sun tunnels. And in some ways, sort of like Stonehenge, bringing the heavens down to earth. And I'll show you how she does that in just a moment. These are just a couple of images. This is an installation image. These were massive, massive tunnels that she has placed in the ground, connected to the ground. Each tunnel weighs 22 tons and rests on a buried concrete foundation. They are 9 feet and 2.5 inches tall, so they can easily fit people inside of them. Now, when we're thinking about framing up a view, you can really see that they do that exquisitely in the same way as a site like Stonehenge does. In fact, they do align with the solstice sun every year as well. And people I know sort of journey out to see it in the sun tunnels. Those holes that I mentioned that were punched into these tunnels align with certain constellations, just in terms of their spacing and their size, and they create these wonderful patterns that slowly move through the tunnels over the course of the day. As I was reading about the sun tunnels, I read that because they're concrete and they're so dense, they actually stay much cooler than the rest of the desert. So it could be like 20 degrees cooler inside one of these sun tunnels. And I thought, how amazing would it be to travel out there and just kind of dwell in the space and watch how these patterns move around and really appreciate these views that she has framed for us. So in the end, she has created this kind of beautiful, simple poetry in the desert landscape that is there for people to go and experience and enjoy. It's really not about entropy at all. It's about public art. And that's what Nancy Holt is probably best known for. Here's just another gorgeous view here. So this next work for Nancy Holt that I wanted to share with you is called Stone Enclosure. It dates to 1978, and this is on the campus of Western Washington University. So this is a site that was designed with people in mind. It's on a college campus. People were going to go and look at it and walk through it and experience it in every way. So with the rock rings, which really remind me of Stonehenge once again, she was working with stonemasons and with astronomers to create these very specific views and a series of portals here. So you can see, even though it's just 2 concentric rings, it creates this wonderful tunnel effect. And then also, once again, sort of like this portal effect with the windows, almost as though you're looking through the lens of a camera. So with this work, Nancy Holt sort of ushers in this new career of this engagement with public sculpture and public parks. And this is really where her career sort of sings and thrives. And so I'll just leave you with this last work by her, which is located in Alexandria, Virginia. This is her 1984 commission called Dark Star Park. Really sounds like Star Wars to me, but this is a testament to how positive usage of a space can really transform underutilized and sort of ugly spaces in cities. So this is the before picture, and this is the after. And what Nancy Holt has really added to this space is the configuration of these massive concrete balls that sort of look like stars that have fallen to the earth. I have a couple of alternative views for you here. This is sort of looking back in the direction that we came from. We can see some of these balls are just perched on the edge or inside little pools, circular pools of water. There's also a circular bridge over here, but the park extends even further. If we're looking at it from above, these are the stars that we were just looking at, but even across the street, there's two more concrete spheres here. And you can see that they are sitting on like these black patches of ground right next to these poles. Here's Nancy Holt standing in front of that same spot in the installation over here once it was finished. And what she did over here, very simple, but it's wonderful. It's poetic. There's these wonderful alignments, of course, with her installation. But the poles and the black spots here tell the time. They mark a particular date in history. And it's actually the date of the acquisition of this land in 1860. So it's at a very specific time on August 1st that the shadows of those spheres and of those poles line up. And look at the crowd that goes there to see it. I mean, it's a community celebration to think about the history of this land and celebrate it around this artistic installation. Nancy Holt has created something that lives on and changes the way the people experience the landscape and think about the history of the land. So we'll wrap up our thoughts about Nancy Holt here with just sort of what happened with her career. Here she is with her husband, Robert Smithson, when they were still so young. She never remarried after his death. She lived another 40 years. She created so many works of art, won a number of prestigious awards, not enough in my estimation. And she died in 2014 at the age of 75. And her will established the Holt Smithson Foundation, which has an incredible website. And according to her will, the foundation will dissolve in 2038. So you have a few years to look at the website, but that will be the 100th anniversary of both of their birthdays. So sort of like Robert Smithson's interest in entropy, all things must fade, and so will the foundation. But it's an incredible resource for both of their artistic careers, if you want to check out that website. So we're going to turn our attention now to another female earth artist, and one that worked in a completely different vein from the two artists that we've seen so far. Ana Mendietta is a fascinating figure, and she doesn't exactly line up with the timeline of Smithson and Holt. She was a full 10 years younger than them, and she wasn't a part of these New York City circles of conceptual artists. She was living in Iowa. She was still in college, actually, when Smithson was making the spiral jetty, but like Smithson, she would end up having a premature and really tragic death. So Ana Mendietta's backstory is that she was born and raised in Cuba. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, this is her front and center here. Her family was from a very comfortable upper middle class neighborhood. But in the end, she and her oldest sister were sent to America as sort of like political refugees. It was called part of Operation Peter Pan. And she was sent just on the cusp of her teen years. So I think she was just about 12 years old. She and her sister lived in foster homes, in orphanages. They were educated at reform schools. It was a really challenging time to be away from your parents and your family, and a really difficult existence for her as a teenager. But she still managed to go to college, and she discovered her love for art as a teenager. She attended the University of Iowa, and she earned a BA, an MA, and an MFA, all related to the arts. And as she was studying, there was a horrific act of violence against a woman on campus. And so Ana Mendietta's art from the very beginning was marked by this interest in the body, this interest in violence, in the vulnerability of women. And so she moves to New York City just after she graduates in 1977. But I wanted to show you just a couple of the works that she created when she was in college, just to give you a sense in terms of how forward thinking this incredible young woman was, because she's doing things in the works that we see here that I think would still be considered kind of interesting and cutting edge today. These are untitled works that are just captured in photography, but essentially what she's doing is using the clippings and the shavings from a fellow student and applying them to her own face to transform her likeness. This is a little bit of playing with her body, with her gender identification. This is, like I said, these are topics that I feel like most Americans are still kind of grappling with today. It's distorting our notions of traditional beauty and all of its constructs in the process. So I bring in this example because it shows Ana Mendietta's curiosity with organic materials such as hair, and the fact that hair itself is kind of living and growing, but also dead cells. So it's easily severed from our bodies, and this idea of being severed and dead and alive, we'll see, comes back again and again with her work. This is one other student work that she did, also it from 1972. It's called Blood and Feathers. It's a video where essentially in this video, this is just a still of it, of course, she pours chicken blood all over her nude body and then rolls around on the ground in all these feathers, and then sort of stands up and adopts this positioning of like a bird that's about to take flight. So once again, she's thinking about organic materials. She's doing this outside, and she's creating this work that has these larger references to death, to sacrifice, to transformation. So her interest in kind of religious rituals also informs a lot of her art. Now, Ana Mendietta's art could not be more different from Robert Smithson's. His was on a grand scale. It's monumental. Her work is on a very personal level. He called his work earthworks. She calls her work bodyworks. And so she does this whole series called the Silhouette series that looks very much like what we're seeing over here. They're photographs that are inspired by her bodily engagement with the earth in different settings. In this case, she is lying in a Mexican tomb, and there's all these flowers that are shoved into, into the folds between her arms and her legs here. So again, it's this idea of what is living, what is dead, playing with that notion there. But the Silhouette series continues in sites like Cuba, where she was originally from, in sites like Mexico and Iowa, where she feels like she has this deep connection. And so it's sort of land art, it's sort of body art, it's sort of performance art. In a 1981 statement, she said, "I have been carrying out a dialogue between the landscape and the female body based on my own silhouette. I believe this has been a direct result of my having been torn from my homeland, Cuba, during my adolescence. I am overwhelmed by the feeling of having been cast from the womb or nature. My art is the way I reestablish the bonds that unite me to the universe. It is a return to the maternal source." So she continues on with this series in a number of really interesting, really provocative ways. Sometimes there's a lot of chicken blood in her artwork. This is indeed her lying face down in a pool of chicken blood, which sort of seems like a precursor in terms of what is going to happen to her, because when she eventually moves to New York City in 1977, she immediately gets involved in these women's artistic circles, but she also meets that minimalist artist, Carl Andre, the creator of the pile of bricks that we had talked about earlier on, and they become romantically involved. He is 13 years older than her. He's a well-established artist at this time. He's already had a solo exhibition at the Guggenheim, but they begin to date, and they date several years, and they're known for their drinking and they are known for their fighting. They get married in 1985, and then just a few months later, Ana Mendietta goes out the window of their 34th floor apartment in Greenwich Village. And it was determined to be an accident, even though Carl Andre was tried for her murder. According to the 911 call, he said, "My wife is an artist and I'm an artist, and we had a quarrel about that fact that I was more exposed to the public than she was. She went into the bedroom, I went after her, and she went out the window." So it's interesting, even in the headline here, he's identified as an artist and she is not. Apparently he did have scratches on him. There's a lot of debate in terms of of what happened that night. And most people today view this as an act of domestic violence. So Carl Andre, who is alive and well at the age of 86 and still has exhibitions at major institutions around the globe, when they open up, women are there and they are demanding accountability for what happened to his wife, saying, you know, where is Ana Mendietta? And I think Ana Mendietta would be very proud to know that in her name, they throw around a lot of chicken blood in front of the entrance to establishments that exhibit his artwork. Even the Guerrilla Girls, the anonymous collective that call themselves the conscience of the art world, have compared Carl Andre to O.J. Simpson. So certainly his career, his life has been forever marred by this. And in recent years, there's been so much interest in Ana Mendietta and her artwork. So in the last few minutes we have, I want to make sure I spend enough time on Andy Goldsworthy because he is a favorite for so many. The OBE here is the Order of the British Empire. He was made an officer of the British Empire in 2000 when he was awarded for his contributions to the arts. So he is, once again, sort of outside of that New York City circle where earth art really first got started. Now, he is today living in Scotland. He's almost a decade younger than Ana Mendietta, I believe, and he is about 65 years old today, also briefly married to a sculptor. So he grew up on a farm and he associates a lot of the sculpture that he makes today with the repetitive, sometimes almost thoughtless motions that you have to do when you're working on a farm, like digging up a potato, that sort of thing. He did go to college and he studied art, but he didn't really like the small studio space that he had. And one day he went out to the ocean and he kind of experimented with rocks and moving rocks around and, you know, what happened with the tidal waves and that sort of thing. And he decided he never wanted to go back inside after that. He talked to his professor about it and his professor was like, you need to learn about Robert Smithson. So from there on in, he dedicated himself to making earthworks. Now, to do a quick comparison between Spiral Jetty and the works that Andy Goldsworthy were making, there's it's night and day. This is a rare spiral form by Andy Goldsworthy, but his work tends to be much more intimate in scale. And sort of like Smithson, he's kind of aware of the fact that once you make something like this out of natural materials set in nature, then nature sort of takes it over. And he gives it up to nature. He takes a picture of it and then he moves on. But he's not trying to create massive monumental works in the same way that Robert Smithson was. But let's pay attention to this work that we have on the screen here. Most of his works are untitled, but he has taken these beach stones. He has laboriously split them perfectly in half and kind of scratched away some of the pigment here, and then created this spiral within the spiral form here. So this is not just an accidental arrangement. This is something that he really labored over and he arranged within this kind of beach setting with all the natural stones around them. And then once he makes it, he takes a picture and he walks away from it. Some of his earliest works were really just moving rocks around on the beach. You can see he made a line into the water here and a circle, and he just kind of watched as, you know, the sand sunk in some of the stones, people walking by tripped over them. He's just really interested in using natural materials as his sculptural forms, or as his medium, I should say. He became the father of modern day rock balancing. In the late 1970s, he was lifting up pretty heavy rocks in order to do this, always made sure he got the picture of them being perfectly balanced, and occasionally he would even get a picture of when they fell over. In subsequent years, he was working with smaller stones, but much more elaborate compositions, as you can see here. He didn't just work with rocks, he also works with sticks, all kinds of other natural materials. This is, I just think that this is such a wonderful installation. This is from 2006. And this little installation with all of these rounded sticks sort of looks like Saturn or a planet. It's just really fantastic. Or it reminds me of, the ripple of water when you cast a stone into a pond like this. He said that just finding the sticks was the hardest part in terms of creating this work of art. And of course, after he snaps the picture, they all just sort of float away. So he can create something that seems to have this larger message, larger meaning. And sometimes he just creates things that are interesting and beautiful. Here he's used sticks to create this kind of meandering sort of snake-like form in the grass on a grand scale, but certainly not on a monumental scale. This is just called Sycamore Sticks in a Line from 1983. He got really frustrated creating something like this. And so often, if you watch videos of him, and there are plenty of them on YouTube, if you watch videos of him creating these works, there's a lot of failure before he reaches his goal. And with this work, he wrote in his journal that this was a work, it was so wet, it was really starting to irritate him. But in more recent years, his stick compositions have just been jaw-dropping. I love this little bridge that doesn't span the water here, but kind of emerges from it and then re-enters the water over here. And then this unbelievable Gothic pointed arch and this incredible compilation of logs and vines to create this structure that sort of spans these knolls on either side. It's really, really stunning. Andy Goldsworthy is also known to do a little bit of performance or body art, injecting his own self into his work sometimes. So this is a photograph that's called Hedge Crawl, where he sort of looks like this massive stick man who's one and the same with the landscape that he's working with. Another thing that he's really famous for doing are these rain shadows. And of course, in the UK, it rains a little bit all the time. So he got very accustomed to doing this. But when he feels a little bit of precipitation, he's known to lie down anywhere and everywhere until the rain stops and he can stand up and his silhouette is there for at least for the picture. It begs the comparison between his work and Ana Mendietta's, where we've got this kind of curvy, contained silhouette, and dare I say, a little bit of man spreading in comparison with Andy Goldsworthy. Sometimes he'll meet up with a curator and be, walking down the street talking about an exhibition and just have to do a rain shadow. He even does them in city settings. This is him doing a rain shadow in New York City. People are like jumping over him as he, trying to get to work as he's just lying there on the sidewalk. He also uses leaves as almost like paint, and he just arranges leaves based on their colors to create these incredible compositions. He loves this nest-like circular formation over here. And then once again, another kind of meandering line, in this case, yellow leaves with a green stripe that slowly transform into a yellow stripe on green leaves. If you Google Andy Goldsworthy, one of the first images that comes up is this one here, which is a sycamore tree from 2013, where he's literally just taken the leaves of this tree and arranged them around the root structure, and it makes it look like it is glowing. My 7-year-old said the floor is lava when he saw it. He also takes similar leaves and creates almost like a police tape line going across this little stream over here. And sometimes he just uses his own spit to stick the leaves around a branch like this, almost like creating a sweater for it. So he's using these really familiar natural materials in all sorts of ways, but he's also really celebrated for using snow and ice and creating these fantastic compositions. Imagine making a spiral icicle, or an icicle that seems to weave in and out of a rock like this. And he's doing this simply by breaking icicles down applying his spit and forming them back together in these really interesting shapes. These are really difficult tasks, and sometimes the sun is working against him. They only get a very small amount of snow where he lives in Scotland, so he's always kind of racing against the clock before it thaws or just completely disappears. I love this necklace of snowballs here. It looks like something you could do, but you would never think to do. And then this kind of snake-like formation made out of just, the very tiny traces of snow that are there. Some of his ice sculptures are absolutely mesmerizing. The starburst here is incredible. It's from 2010. Apparently it collapsed 2 days later. It's the sort of thing that once the sun hits it, it's sort of gone, but at least we have a chance to see it. And he creates it on his own. It's not like he brings tours to come and see his sculptures over time, but he is interested in traveling around the world to create using sort of the native material, the materials that are, or the landscape that is essential to specific sites. So here he is literally on top of the planet at the very North Pole, where he created these 3 circular doors, these portals, using Inuit ice and snow cutting methods. It is very hard to create an arch. Next time you're playing out in the snow with your kids or your grandkids, try to make an arch. It's difficult. And here he definitely makes it look easy. I'm almost thinking of Nancy Holt's sun tunnels and framing up the landscape with an installation like this. So we'll wrap up with Andy Goldsworthy with an American installation that is not too far away if you were interested in seeing some of his works. This is at Storm King, and it's a stone wall that he created at the end of the 1990s. It was sort of inspired by a kind of ancient stone wall that was already there, kind of falling apart from the days of early farming in America. And he sort of liked this idea of how so often these stone walls weren't even used to separate out livestock. Sometimes they almost just seem to be separating out the trees from each other. So this meandering line of a stone wall is literally just separating trees from each other. I also read a really interesting analysis of this work about how Andy Goldsworthy sort of thought that Americans are always interested in taking sides. And sometimes taking sides still means that you're standing side by side with your neighbor. I thought that was a really interesting way to look at this as well. So this installation, this meandering wall, as you can see over here, goes right down into this little lake and incidentally comes up on the other side of the lake as a perfectly straight wall over here. So there's a lot to really enjoy about Andy Goldsworthy's work. We'll wrap up very quickly with just the big ideas about these 4 artists. We had Robert Smithson. He was our philosophical sort of heart of this entire movement. He introduces the key concepts, he makes them real and on a grand scale. Then we saw Nancy Holt, and she was the artist that brought the heavens down to earth. She created things that weren't meant to slowly erode by the earth, but things that were meant to last and to bring people together. They are destinations and they are gathering spaces, places to celebrate and enjoy. And then we saw Ana Mendietta and her Silhouetta series. Ana Mendietta made earth art personal. Her works excavated her emotional pain, issues about body and gender. They're raw and powerful in their vulnerability. And of course, some of them seem to foretell her truly tragic and untimely death. And then we wrapped up with Andy Goldsworthy. He is, I think of him as like the craftsman who created these incredible ephemeral constructions and engagements with nature and landscape, always producing something incredible that nature never could. Andy Goldsworthy, will just leave off tonight with a quote from him. He said, "We often forget that we are nature. Nature is not something separate from us. So when we say that we have lost our connection to nature, we have lost our connection to ourselves." So I think those are marching orders to get out and put your hands in the dirt. So hopefully you can work on your garden or your yard or something like that sometime in the near future. I'll end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have about the artists we looked at tonight.
Jane, thanks so much. Does anyone have any questions? So far, we only have a comment from a couple comments saying wonderful talk.
Thank you, everybody, for the kind words. I appreciate it. And Judy, for tuning in while you're on vacation. That's really nice. That means so much to me. Oftentimes people ask, where can they see Robert Smithson's, or Andy Goldsworthy's work? And there are some local institutions, maybe closest to Maynard might be the DeCordova Museum. I believe they have some of his works. Also, the Alnoba Sculpture Park in Kensington, New Hampshire has some of his work too. So it's nice to know that you can see a few of these works. You don't have to travel out to the Great Salt Lake yet.
I'll just put in a plug for museum passes. I know Maynard has a pass for DeCordova, and it's always fascinating to go there and see the wide variety of sculpture on view. We do have a question from Joan. How did you get interested in this kind of artwork? It's funny because whenever you study history or art history, whenever your professor gets up to the modern era, anything post 1950, they always rush right through it because there's never enough time to cover it. But I do remember when I was in an undergrad, one of my professors sort of touching on Robert Smithson, and I thought the ideas around the spiral jetty were really interesting, but then just knowing that he got his start literally by bringing piles of dirt into New York City galleries, I thought, wow, that's so fascinating. And then Ana Mendietta's life story is just amazing. And Andy Goldsworthy's stuff is so enchanting. It's hard not to love all of this. And there's so many other artists too that we didn't even get a chance to touch on. Oh, Janice mentioned that there's a permanent installation created by Carl Andre in the field across from the Wadsworth Athenaeum. Oh, that's really interesting. Now, the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford is one of my very favorite art museums. So I absolutely recommend anyone getting down there, but I don't know if you'd be too jazzed to see Carl Andre after tonight. Oh, all right, any other questions for Jane? Any comments, recommendations? There's a comment from Maxine.
Maxine mentions Jean-Claude and Christo, and they are definitely, if I ever do Earth Art Part 2, I would definitely include them because I just love their work so much. And some of you might be familiar with the Gates installation that they did in Central Park. When was that? Probably in the mid 2000s, I think. But they were definitely doing these large sort of temporary engagements with different landscapes like New York City Central Park or the California coast or something like that. Their work, I just love it too. They might deserve their very own 1 hour program. So I'm glad you mentioned them.
All right, maybe we'll wrap up here. For me at the Maynard Library and Tina at the Randall Library in Stowe. Jane, it was another wonderful, thought-provoking, visually fascinating evening. We appreciate it and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Have a great night.
Good night.